Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. I had been in a restless slumber when the sound came. 3 sharp, frantic knocks at the door of 221B Baker Street. The clock on the mantel had just struck midnight, and London lay wrapped in a thick, suffocating fog. I sat upright, pulse quickened by the urgency in the knock. A moment later, I heard Holmes stir in the darkness, the scrape of a chair, the whisper of his dressing gown against the wooden floor. Mrs. Hudson's muffled protests drifted from below as she unlatched the door. A moment later, hurried footsteps climbed the stairs, light and trembling. A woman. She stood at our threshold, her face ghostly pale, her breathing shallow, as if she had outrun some unseen terror. Her dark eyes, wide with fright, darted across the room before settling upon Holmes. "You must help me," she whispered. "He's dead. And he shouldn't be." Holmes observed her with that peculiar piercing stillness of his. I rose, offering a chair, but she remained frozen, gripping the doorframe as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. "Madam," Holmes said, his voice calm, deliberate. "Tell us everything." She swallowed, the words catching in her throat before she managed to speak. "My name is Eleanor Redgrave, and my fiancé, Charles Winthrop, was murdered tonight. But—" she hesitated, eyes glistening. "But he died 2 years ago." A silence fell upon the room, thick, unrelenting. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to flicker uncertainly. I glanced at Holmes. He had not moved, nor had his expression changed. Only his eyes, sharp as the blade of a scalpel, betrayed his growing interest. "Watson," he murmured at last, "I believe we have a case." Miss Redgrave's hands trembled as she recounted the unthinkable. I was alone in my house," she said, her voice brittle. "I'd been reading in my study when I heard a noise from upstairs. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then—" She paused, her breath hitching. Holmes gestured for her to continue. I climbed the stairs, my candle flickering with every step. The house was silent. But when I reached the door to the bedroom— She exhaled sharply, as if speaking the words aloud might solidify their horror. "Go on," Holmes pressed, his gaze never leaving hers. "The door was open," she whispered, "and inside, I saw him." I felt a chill settle over my spine. "Charles?" I asked. She nodded, eyes glistening. "He was there, lying on the floor, his body twisted, blood pooling beneath him. A knife was buried in his chest." She clenched her hands tightly. "But it was him, Doctor. I know it was him." Holmes studied her carefully. "And yet, Miss Redgrave," he said, "you claim Charles Winthrop died 2 years ago." She nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "We buried him. I saw his coffin lowered into the ground. I grieved for him." Her voice was desperate now, searching. "But tonight, I saw him. He was there, and now he's dead again." A rational explanation eluded me, and I turned to Holmes, expecting the usual flicker of skepticism. But there was none. Instead, there was something far more unsettling, a gleam of intrigue. Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "We must go to your home at once," he said. "I wish to see the body." I expected Holmes to challenge the impossibility of Miss Redgrave's claim, to dismiss it as hysteria or some fevered trick of the mind. But he did not. Instead, he sat in uncharacteristic silence, his eyes narrowed in thought. "You believe me, then?" Eleanor asked, barely above a whisper. Holmes lifted a brow. "Belief, Miss Redgrave, is a rather imprecise notion. I believe in facts." He stood, adjusting his coat. "And the facts, as you present them, are most fascinating indeed." His sudden animation caught me off guard. I had seen Holmes intrigued before, but this was something else entirely. A case that defied logic. A crime that should not have been possible. Miss Redgrave rose, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. "But the body, She hesitated. What if it's gone? Holmes smiled faintly. Then we shall have an even greater mystery on our hands. The streets of London were restless that night. Fog clung to the cobblestones like a shroud, distorting the flickering gaslights into eerie, wavering ghosts. Miss Redgrave walked between us, her hurried steps betraying her unease. This is madness, I muttered to Holmes as we passed the looming silhouette of St. Paul's Cathedral. A man cannot die twice. Holmes merely smiled, a rare, unreadable expression. And yet, Watson, he murmured, we have seen many things that should not be. A distant bell tolled the hour. Midnight had passed, and the city seemed to hold its breath. At last, we reached Eleanor's townhouse, a tall, stately building that now seemed to crouch beneath the night sky, its windows dark and watchful. Miss Redgrave hesitated at the threshold. I left him in the bedroom, she whispered. Holmes inclined his head, then stepped inside, and as I followed, a chill crawled down my spine, for the house was utterly silent, the kind of silence that hides things. Eleanor hesitated before turning the key in the lock. The townhouse loomed above us, its windows dark and uninviting, the gaslights along the street barely illuminating the heavy fog that clung to its walls. As she pushed open the door, a wave of stifling stillness greeted us. The air was thick, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. Holmes stepped inside first, his gaze moving swiftly, analytically. I followed, my fingers instinctively grazing the revolver in my coat pocket. There was something terribly wrong about the silence. The door was locked when you left? Holmes asked. Eleanor nodded. From the inside. Holmes tried the latch, still secured. He moved swiftly to the windows. Each one was latched shut, the glass streaked with condensation from the cold night air. No sign of forced entry, I muttered. No footprints outside either, Holmes added, glancing at the damp ground beneath the windows. No means of entry, and, more curiously, no means of exit. Eleanor shuddered. He was in the bedroom, she whispered. Upstairs. Holmes gave a single nod. Then let us see what impossibility awaits us. The stairs creaked beneath our weight as we ascended, the house suffocatingly still. The air was heavy, laced with the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. Holmes entered first, and I followed, my pulse quickening. And there, on the study floor, lay the corpse of Charles Winthrop. He was sprawled on his side, his face pale and lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. A knife protruded from his chest, its hilt stained dark with blood. The pool beneath him was still wet and glistening, fresh. My breath caught in my throat. It was impossible. We had seen the records. We had heard Eleanor's testimony. Charles Winthrop had been dead for 2 years. Yet here he was, newly murdered, his flesh still warm. Eleanor let out a strangled gasp, her hands covering her mouth. I told you, she whispered, barely able to stand. I told you it was him. Holmes said nothing. He moved swiftly, kneeling beside the body, his long fingers hovering just above the skin, sensing, absorbing. There is no mistake, he murmured. This man has been dead for no more than an hour. I felt the world tilt. Holmes! This cannot be. His fingers brushed the corpse's sleeve, then his eyes snapped upward, sharp and knowing. Observe, Watson. The answer is here, hidden in plain sight. Holmes's gaze swept the floor with the precision of a predator. And then, he stopped. There, just beside the body, a single footprint marred the wooden floorboards. I followed his gaze, my breath catching. It was out of place, faint but unmistakable. A print where none should be. Holmes studied it carefully, his eyes narrowing. This, he murmured, is not an accident. I swallowed, my skin crawling. Someone was here? Holmes exhaled slowly. Yes, but the more important question, Watson, is whether they ever left. Eleanor let out a sudden, strangled cry. We turned sharply. The body was gone. For a moment, my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. The floor where Charles Winthrop had lain was now empty. The blood remained, dark and pooling, but the corpse had vanished. Eleanor's hands trembled violently as she backed away. "This is not possible," I whispered. Holmes, however, remained eerily composed. He stepped forward, touching the now vacant space, his fingers pressing lightly against the floor. "The door never opened," he murmured. "The windows remained shut." His voice was almost admiring. "This," he said softly, "is an exceptionally well-played game." Holmes rose, dusting off his coat, his expression unreadable. "Watson," he said, his voice almost amused. "We have encountered strange cases before, but this one should not be possible." I could find no words. A locked room murder, a corpse that should not exist, and now a body that had disappeared before our very eyes. I looked at Holmes, desperate for an answer. But for once, even he seemed uncertain. And that, I realized, was the most terrifying thing of all. Chapter 2. Ghosts, Lies, and Secrets. The hour was late, and the city lay wrapped in a thick, suffocating fog as we rode in silence toward Highgate Cemetery. The streets of London had long since emptied, yet an air of unease settled over me as our carriage rattled through the mist. Holmes, ever composed, sat with his chin resting lightly upon his fingers, his gaze unfixed, lost in some labyrinth of thought. Beside him, Miss Redgrave sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The shadows under her eyes, the tremor in her breath, spoke to more than sleepless nights. They spoke to a woman on the edge of reason. As we passed through the iron gates of the cemetery, the very air seemed to change. The cold became sharper, more biting, and an unnatural stillness hung over the gravestones. Even the wind dared not stir. "His grave is this way," Eleanor whispered, leading us along a winding path lined with weathered headstones and forgotten names. Finally, she stopped before a tall, imposing marker, its inscription barely visible in the dim lantern light. "Charles Winthrop, beloved son and devoted fiancé. 1881 to 1893. I exhaled, my breath visible in the chill air. "And yet," I murmured, "we saw his body only last night." Holmes knelt, running his fingers lightly over the damp earth. "We shall see if Charles Winthrop rests beneath our feet," he said coolly, "or if he ever did at all." A grave worker, an older man with a weathered face and uneasy eyes, hesitated as Holmes pressed a sovereign into his palm. This is not proper," the man muttered, glancing warily at the surrounding graves. "Digging up the dead at this hour. I want no part in this." Holmes's voice was low and commanding. "And yet you shall assist us." With a reluctant nod, the worker lifted his spade. The first shovel of earth landed with a dull, muffled thud. Then another, and another. Minutes stretched into eternity as the soil was cleared, exposing the rotting wood of the casket below. Eleanor let out a shuddering breath. The worker paused, wiping his brow. "This is madness," he whispered. Holmes gave a sharp nod. "Open it." The man hesitated before lifting the rusted latch. A creak, long, agonizing, filled the night air as the lid slowly rose. Watson gasped. The coffin was empty. Not a fragment of bone, not a scrap of cloth, only the hollow impression where a body once lay. I turned to Eleanor, expecting hysteria, but she merely stood there, staring into the coffin with vacant eyes. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew it all along." Holmes straightened, his sharp eyes scanning the disturbed soil around the grave. "He was never here," he murmured. A chill crawled down my spine. "Then where the devil is he?" Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "That, Watson, is what we must now uncover." Back at 221B Baker Street, Eleanor sat before the fire, her trembling hands retrieving a bundle of aged letters from her bag. "They arrived in the months after his death," she whispered, "always unsigned. But I know his handwriting. I know it as I know my own. Holmes took the topmost letter, his sharp eyes scanning the inked words. But one thing stood out above all else. The space where a name should have been was left empty. A death certificate, I muttered, but unsigned. Holmes tapped a finger against the parchment, his voice quiet but sharp. Watson, someone had been preparing for Charles Winthrop's death long before it occurred. Eleanor paled. You mean? Holmes folded the paper precisely. I mean that his demise was no accident. It was not an act of impulse. He exhaled, his gaze unreadable. It was carefully designed. A heavy silence filled the room, and then Holmes reached back into the hidden compartment, retrieving a single crumpled note. His eyes darkened as he read the words. The parchment was worn, its edges torn as if it had been clutched in desperation or fear. Holmes held it between two fingers, reading aloud. If you speak the truth, your fate will be worse than death. A ripple of unease passed through me. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Who sent it? Holmes turned the paper over. No signature, no seal, only the warning. He studied it carefully, his fingers running lightly over the ink. This was written not long before his first death. I swallowed hard. Then Charles was being silenced. Holmes nodded. And whatever he knew. He glanced toward Eleanor, his voice measured. He may have told you without realizing it. Eleanor stiffened. But I don't know anything, she whispered. Holmes held up the note. Someone believes you do. Holmes stood motionless, the note still in his grasp. His gaze had taken on that faraway look I knew well, the look of a man assembling a puzzle whose pieces had only now begun to take shape. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the room had turned frigid. Eleanor watched Holmes, her voice barely above a whisper. What does this mean? Holmes exhaled. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but his eyes were dark with something that unsettled me. Watson, he said, turning toward me. This is no longer just a murder investigation. He placed the note gently on the desk, his fingers pressing lightly against the words. This, he murmured, is something far darker. A heavy silence filled the air, and for the first time since the case began, I saw something in Holmes's expression that I had never seen before. A shadow of uncertainty. Chapter 3. The Man Who Shouldn't Exist. Holmes and I spent the next day in pursuit of ghosts. We sought out those who had known Charles Winthrop in life. Old acquaintances, business partners, friends from his university days. But everywhere we went, we were met with hesitation, evasions, or outright refusals to speak. A former colleague, a barrister by trade, paled at the mere mention of Charles's name. I have nothing to say on the matter, he stammered before slamming his office door in our faces. An old schoolmate, when pressed, merely shook his head. Leave it be, Mr. Holmes, he murmured. Some men are better left buried. It was the same wherever we turned. Holmes observed it all with growing intensity, his sharp eyes cataloguing every reaction, every nervous tick. He did not yet have the full picture, but the edges of the puzzle were beginning to form. And then, at last, we found someone who was willing, if not eager, to talk. A former physician, a man whose name had appeared on Charles Winthrop's death certificate, and he was drowning in drink. The tavern was dimly lit and thick with the scent of stale liquor and pipe smoke. In a darkened corner, a man sat hunched over a bottle, his hands trembling with excess and regret. Dr. Elias Mercer. Holmes approached without hesitation, sliding into the seat opposite him. I require a moment of your time, Doctor. Mercer, he said coolly. It concerns a signature you once placed on a death certificate. Mercer flinched at the words. His bloodshot eyes flickered toward us, darting between fear and recognition. I don't know what you mean, he muttered, reaching for his bottle. Holmes intercepted his grasp with a swift hand. You know exactly what I mean. His voice, though quiet, carried a weight that could crush a man's resolve. I watched as Mercer swallowed hard, his throat convulsing. Then, in a voice thick with guilt, he whispered, "I never saw the body." A silence settled over the table. Holmes's expression did not change, but I felt the air between us tighten. "I was paid," Mercer continued, his voice barely audible. "A sum far beyond what a man of my station could refuse. I signed the certificate, but I never examined the body." The confession hung between us, a lead weight pressing down on the table. "Who paid you?" Holmes asked. Mercer let out a brittle laugh, hollow and humourless. "Ask the dead," he said. "They know better than I." By the time the sun had begun its descent, Holmes had led us to an old, long-abandoned asylum on the outskirts of London. The building loomed against the twilight sky, its stone walls weathered and crumbling, its windows dark, empty sockets. Inside, the air was damp, the scent of rot and mildew clinging to every surface. The corridors stretched long and silent, littered with forgotten remnants of the past. A rusted wheelchair, a toppled medicine cabinet, old patient files strewn across the floor like autumn leaves. Holmes moved with purpose and precision, his steps eerily quiet against the stone floor. We descended into the records room, where rows upon rows of ledgers lined the shelves, histories of those who had once been confined within these walls. Holmes's fingers moved swiftly across the spines, scanning, searching. Then, without hesitation, he plucked a single book from the shelf and flipped it open. The pages crackled under his touch, and then he froze. "Here," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned the ledger toward me, and my breath caught in my throat. There, in precise ink, was the name we had been chasing. Charles Winthrop, dated a full year after his supposed death. I could not tear my gaze from the ledger. This isn't possible," I muttered. "His death was recorded 2 years ago." Holmes said nothing. His fingers traced the entry in the book, his mind working through possibilities with relentless precision. Charles Winthrop had not been buried in Highgate Cemetery. He had been sent here, locked away within the walls of an asylum, his existence erased by ink and deception. But why? Holmes snapped the ledger shut. "Watson, tell me, why would a man be declared dead only to be hidden away in a place like this?" I exhaled, my thoughts racing. "He knew something," I said, "something worth silencing." Holmes nodded. "And when he escaped, when he tried to reclaim his life, he was silenced for good." A cold understanding settled over me. Charles Winthrop had never truly died that first time. But when he finally did, it was because someone had decided that his existence, however hidden, was still too dangerous to be allowed. Holmes turned toward the shadows of the abandoned asylum, his voice barely a breath. "The question is," he murmured, "what was he trying to warn us about?" It was well past midnight when we reached Eleanor's townhouse, the cold London fog wrapping around the gas lamps like ghostly fingers. There was no light from within, no sign of movement. An unnerving silence pressed upon us as Holmes rapped his knuckles against the door. No answer. A sudden distant clang of metal made me start. Holmes, however, did not flinch. His sharp gaze dropped to the threshold, where a thin, glistening streak of water led from the doorstep into the house. Holmes pressed his hand against the door. It yielded beneath his touch. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic, something that set my teeth on edge. And then, as we stepped into the dim corridor, we saw her. Eleanor's maid lay collapsed upon the floor, her frail body twitching in feverish delirium. Sweat clung to her pallid skin, her lips moving soundlessly, muttering, whispering, as if trapped in some waking nightmare. Holmes crouched beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her wrist. "She is alive," he murmured. A choked whimper escaped the maid's lips. "The dead," she whispered. "The dead have come for her." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. "Eleanor is gone," he said. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that he was right. The maid's breathing was shallow, her hands gripping at empty air as if warding off unseen spectres. I knelt beside her. "You must tell us what happened," I urged gently. Her eyes fluttered open, wide, wild, filled with terror. She was speaking to someone," she rasped, just before she disappeared. Holmes leaned in, his voice steady but insistent. "Who?" The maid's lips trembled. "He said his name was Charles." A terrible stillness settled over the room. I felt the hairs at the back of my neck rise. "That's impossible." Holmes exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping against his knee, a sign I knew of rapid thought. "Tell me, did you see him?" he asked. The maid squeezed her eyes shut. "I heard his voice," she whispered, "but I knew it wasn't truly him." The room seemed to darken. Holmes stood abruptly. "Watson, we are leaving." I hesitated. "Where are we going?" He turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "To the asylum," he said. The road to Ravenshire Asylum was long and uninviting. The moon, swollen and pale, hung low in the sky as our carriage rattled along the uneven path, the black silhouette of the institution looming in the distance. Holmes sat in silence, his fingers pressed together, his gaze distant. I knew better than to disturb him. As we reached the entrance, the heavy iron gates stood slightly ajar, their hinges groaning softly in the wind. The building itself was a relic of the past, its stone walls worn and weathered by time. Inside, the scent of damp stone and something more pungent, decay perhaps, clung to the air. The gas lamps flickered dimly, barely illuminating the long corridor that stretched before us. The silence was oppressive. A lone attendant, his face drawn and sunken, regarded us with tired suspicion. Holmes presented his card. "We are here regarding a former patient," he said. "Charles Winthrop." The attendant's eyes darkened. "Winthrop," he muttered. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his coat. "That name. It is not one we speak of here." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Then it is one we shall uncover ourselves." Without waiting for permission, he strode down the corridor, his coat billowing behind him like a shadow. I followed. The asylum's archives were a relic of disorder. Shelves lined with yellowed paper, ledgers stacked upon ledgers, their bindings frayed with age. Holmes moved swiftly, his fingers dancing over the spines of the books, until he found the one he sought. "Here," he murmured. He flipped open the ledger, scanning the entries with sharp, hawk-like precision. And then, his hand stilled. I leaned over his shoulder, my breath catching as I read the name, Winthrop, Charles. But the ink that formed it had been violently crossed out, thick black strokes slashing through the letters with almost frenzied intent. Beside it, in dark, ominous scrawl, was a single word. Erased. A cold unease settled over me. "What does it mean?" I whispered. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then softly he spoke. "It means," he said, "that someone has gone to great lengths to ensure Charles Winthrop never existed at all." The air seemed to grow heavier around us, and then a whisper. It was so soft that at first I thought I had imagined it. A low murmur just behind me. "You are not supposed to be here." I turned sharply, my pulse hammering against my ribs. But there was nothing. Only the long corridor stretching into darkness. The empty air where someone, something, had just spoken. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Holmes." He held up a hand, his gaze fixed upon the shadows. "Did you hear it?" I nodded, unable to speak. Holmes stepped forward, his posture tense, his senses sharpened like a predator awaiting the strike. Another whisper, fainter this time. "Leave, before it finds you." A chill curled down my spine, and then A door at the end of the corridor creaked open. A long, slow creak, as if something, or someone, had been waiting. Holmes exhaled, his breath steady, his eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "Curious," he murmured. "Watson, I do believe we're expected." Chapter 4. The Web of Deception. Holmes stood by the window of 221B Baker Street, his silhouette cut sharp against the faint morning light. He had not slept. I could tell from the restless energy in his movements, the way his fingers drummed against the mantelpiece, his keen gaze fixated upon the city beyond, as if London itself might yield its secrets with sufficient scrutiny. "Watson," he said at last without turning, "tell me, what do we know of men who die twice?" I set my tea down, watching him warily. "You have a theory." "I have more than that." He turned, his eyes gleaming. "I have a certainty." I leaned forward. "Charles Winthrop." Holmes nodded. "He was never meant to die, not 2 years ago, nor now. His first death was a fabrication, an erasure, not a demise." A chill prickled at my skin. "Then why stage his murder a second time?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "Because he tried to return," he murmured. "He tried to warn someone." Realization dawned. "Eleanor." Holmes met my gaze. "Precisely." His voice darkened. "And for that, he was made to die. For real this time." A silence stretched between us, weighted with unspoken implications. Charles Winthrop had uncovered something worth silencing. And now, that same force was tightening its grip around Eleanor Redgrave. Holmes worked swiftly, rifling through notes and records as I read over the asylum ledger once more. "He was alive for a year after his death," I muttered. "If he had truly uncovered something, why not come forward?" Holmes looked up. "Because, Watson, he was being hunted." A deep unease settled over me. "Consider this," Holmes continued. "Winthrop vanished, declared dead. But he did not go quietly. He escaped whatever prison they placed him in and attempted to reclaim his life." I exhaled sharply, and failed. Holmes nodded. "The moment he sought Eleanor, whether to warn her or to pass something along, his fate was sealed." A thought struck me, cold and sharp as steel. "Holmes, who has the power to erase a man from existence, to rewrite the very fabric of his life?" He regarded me for a moment before speaking. "A force that operates above the law," he said softly. "An entity older than the crown itself." I stared at him. "You know who did this." His expression darkened. "I know their name." It was nearing dusk when we returned to Victor Langley's townhouse, the gas lamps casting long, flickering shadows along the cobbled street. This time, we were not turned away. Langley sat in his study, the dim light of the hearth illuminating the fine sheen of perspiration upon his brow. He had known we would return. Holmes wasted no time. "Charles Winthrop," he said, "was murdered twice. Once in deception, once in truth. And you, Langley, were the hand that held the pen." Langley flinched. Holmes stepped closer. "But you were never the mastermind, were you?" His voice was low, measured, like a scalpel poised above exposed flesh. "You were merely the instrument." Langley swallowed hard. "Who orchestrated it?" Holmes pressed. "Who gave the order?" Langley's breath came fast and shallow. He hesitated, his gaze darting toward the darkened window, as if fearing some unseen observer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "The 5 ravens." A silence thick as smoke settled between us. Holmes tilted his head slightly. "I see," he murmured. "So they are still playing their game." Langley's hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand, Holmes," he said, his voice raw. "No one walks away from them." Holmes took no more than a moment to process Langley's words before turning sharply toward me. "Watson, think. What did Winthrop give Eleanor?" I hesitated. He wrote to her." Letters. Holmes shook his head. "No, something more. something tangible. His voice sharpened. What did she wear? A flash of memory surfaced. Eleanor, sitting before our fire, clutching something at her throat. A delicate gold pendant, simple but well worn. A keepsake. Holmes's expression turned to steel. She has been carrying it all along, he murmured. Langley's breath caught. You think? Holmes nodded. Whatever Winthrop discovered, he left the final clue hidden upon her person. Langley's face drained of colour. Then God help her, he whispered, because if they know, they will never let her go. Holmes's jaw tightened. They already have her, he said. And in that moment, I saw something rare flicker in his gaze, something I had glimpsed only in the gravest of cases: fear. Holmes had often said that the most effective way to catch a predator was to become its prey. As the evening deepened and the gaslights flickered outside 221B Baker Street, he moved with quiet precision, penning a letter with deliberate strokes. The false message, written in a familiar cipher, would reach the Five Ravens by midnight. What exactly are we offering them? I asked, watching as he sealed the envelope. A trade, he murmured. The item they have killed for, the one they have been hunting. His gaze flickered to me. The pendant, Watson. I exhaled sharply. But we don't have it. Holmes smiled faintly. They don't know that. His eyes darkened. They will come for me, he continued, because in their eyes I have become a loose end. A silence stretched between us. And Eleanor? I asked. Holmes met my gaze, his voice unwavering. They will not kill her, not until they are certain she does not possess what they seek. He straightened. That gives us time. But not much. His fingers steepled beneath his chin. We meet them at the docks. I swallowed. And if they see through your deception? Holmes' expression was unreadable. Then, Watson, he said softly, we shall have to see through theirs first. The Thames lay thick with fog as we arrived at the docks, the air damp with the scent of salt and rotting wood. The warehouses loomed in the darkness, their broken windows like empty sockets, the faint lap of water against the pilings the only sound. Holmes moved ahead, his steps deliberate but silent, his gaze sweeping the shadows. I followed, my revolver cool against my palm, my pulse drumming in my ears. They will be watching us, he murmured. Stay close. A low lantern glow flickered ahead, casting shifting silhouettes across the mist. And then, a figure emerged. Victor Langley. Holmes exhaled, almost amused. You must be desperate, he said. Coming here yourself. Langley's face was drawn, his features pale, but his hands were steady. Where is it? He demanded. Holmes took a step forward. You know as well as I do that Charles left nothing behind. His voice was calm. This was never about a pendant. It was about ensuring the truth never came to light. Langley's jaw tightened, a flicker of movement in the darkness. Holmes did not turn. 4 men, he murmured under his breath. 2 behind the crates, one near the mooring post, another on the walkway. I tensed. Langley took a slow step forward. You walked into this, Holmes, he said. Holmes smiled. And so, Langley, did you. The trap had been set. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, his face emerging from the mist. I felt my breath hitch. Inspector Gregson. Holmes did not move, but something in his expression hardened. Gregson exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. You should have left this alone, Holmes. A silence stretched between them. You, I murmured. You've been working with them. Gregson sighed. Not with them, for them. His voice was weary. You think the police have power, Holmes. You think we control anything. There are forces in this city older than the law itself. Holmes tilted his head slightly. And you were content to let them murder Winthrop? Gregson's jaw tensed. He was already dead, he muttered, the moment he saw what he shouldn't have. His gaze flickered to me, then back to Holmes. "You don't understand, Holmes. You cannot win this." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, and then he smiled. "Perhaps," he murmured. "But I wonder, Gregson, do your new masters know what I have already told Scotland Yard?" Langley stiffened. Gregson's eyes narrowed. Holmes took a slow step forward. "Check your pockets, Langley," he said. Langley's hand flew to his coat, his face twisting in sudden horror. Holmes's smile did not falter. "You see," he murmured, "the moment you left your home tonight, you were already playing my game." Langley's fingers curled into fists. A sharp click, a gun cocking, and then a gunshot. The gunshot shattered the silence. The echo ripped through the night, and for a split second, I could not tell where it had come from. My own breath caught, my pulse hammering. Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed upon Langley. Then, I saw it. Langley's hand wavered, his grip slackening. A single dark stain blossomed upon his chest. He stumbled. The pistol fell from his grasp, clattering against the damp wood. His lips parted, but no words came. He fell. The fog curled around him, swallowing the last breath from his lungs, a sharp intake of breath. Gregson, his gun still raised, his hand trembling. His face was pale, drawn with something I could not name. Holmes's voice was cold. "You were never meant to leave here alive, were you?" Gregson swallowed. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I was never supposed to." His words cut off. His eyes widened. Then he too fell. Behind him, another shadow emerged, a new figure, one I did not recognize. Holmes did. His voice was soft, but sharp as a blade. "So," he murmured, "the raven finally reveals himself." The man smiled. The night swallowed the rest. Chapter 5. The Shadowed Truth. Victor Langley sat before us, his face ashen, his breath unsteady, the dying lantern light casting shadows across the walls of his study. He had tried to run. He had failed. Holmes, standing before him with the air of an executioner, regarded him with an unreadable expression. "You played your part well, Langley," Holmes murmured, "but even the most intricate deceptions leave traces." Langley exhaled, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. "You think you know everything, Holmes," he said, his voice trembling. "But you don't. You never did." Holmes took a step closer, his voice low and precise. "You had Charles Winthrop erased," he said, "silenced. You signed the order for his first death, and when he dared to return, you arranged the second." Langley flinched. "You knew what he had uncovered," Holmes continued, his gaze sharp. "A conspiracy so deep that even your own men feared it. And so, you chose survival over loyalty." Langley swallowed hard. "You cannot stop them, Holmes," he whispered. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Holmes's lips curled slightly. "Perhaps not," he said, "but I can stop you." Langley's breath hitched. He knew his time had run out. Holmes turned away from Langley, his fingers steepled in thought. The puzzle was almost complete, but something was wrong. He exhaled, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Watson, Charles Winthrop was alive until this morning." A shiver ran through me. "You mean?" Holmes nodded. "Someone within our own circle knew where he was. Someone who ensured that when we found the body, it was too late." My stomach twisted. "You suspect one of your own?" Holmes's eyes darkened. "I suspect a man who has been with us from the beginning. A man who fed us precisely the right clues at precisely the right times." I felt the weight of realization settle upon me. "An informant." Holmes exhaled. "A double agent." He turned sharply toward Langley. "Tell me, Langley," he murmured, "how does it feel to be the second most dangerous liar in this room?" Langley stiffened, his gaze flickering, not toward Holmes, not toward me, but toward the shadows behind us. And in that moment, I knew. We were not alone. A soft creak of wood, a presence shifting in the darkness. Holmes did not turn. "How long have you been standing there?" The voice that answered sent a cold shiver through me. "Long enough," it said. Sebastian Clark, one of Holmes's most trusted informants, a man we had relied upon, who had led us through the labyrinth of this case with surgical precision. And now his revolver was levelled at us. Holmes exhaled, almost amused. "Of course," he murmured. "It had to be you." Clark smiled faintly. "Did it?" he asked. "Or did I simply lead you to believe that?" Holmes regarded him with something close to admiration. "You played it beautifully," he said. "You gave me just enough truth to keep me moving, enough misdirection to control where I looked." Clark tilted his head slightly. "It was never personal, Holmes." Holmes's voice was like a blade. "No," he said softly. "It was much worse than that." A long silence. Then, in a voice like the final turn of a key in a lock, Holmes said, "But you made a mistake." Clark's smile faltered, and in that moment, Holmes moved. Clark was fast. Holmes was faster. A sharp movement, a blur of motion, and Clark's revolver was wrenched from his grasp, clattering onto the floor. Before he could react, Holmes had him pinned against the desk, his fingers tightening around Clark's wrist. And then, Holmes leaned in. "I know what you were looking for," he murmured, "and I know where Charles hid it." Clark froze. Holmes turned toward me, his voice unwavering. "Watson, give me Eleanor's pendant." I hesitated for only a moment before retrieving it from my pocket. The small, unassuming locket, the one Eleanor had worn from the beginning. Holmes pressed it into Clark's hand. "Open it." Clark swallowed hard. His fingers trembled as he unclasped the pendant. Inside, a folded scrap of paper lay concealed, hidden within the delicate gold casing. Clark's breath hitched. "No." Holmes plucked the paper from his fingers, unfolding it carefully. Charles Winthrop's last message, the truth he had died for. Holmes read the words aloud. "The 5 ravens are not 5. They are 1. The name you seek." Holmes's voice faltered, his eyes narrowed, and then his expression darkened into something I had never seen before, something close to fear. The wind howled through the ruins of Ravenshire Asylum, its decayed walls looming in the moonlight like the ribs of a great, rotting beast. Holmes and I moved swiftly through the shattered corridors, our footsteps muffled by the thick dust that had settled over decades of abandonment. The asylum had been closed for years, its former inmates scattered or forgotten. But tonight, it was alive once more. Ahead, a flickering lantern glow. A figure moved in the shadows. Langley. Holmes held up a hand, signaling for silence. We crept forward, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and something older, something that should have been left undisturbed. Langley stood at the far end of the hall, his coat whipping in the cold draught. He clutched something in his hands, a bundle of aged, yellowed papers. His eyes darted wildly. Holmes's voice was calm, deliberate. "There is nowhere left to run, Langley." Langley let out a ragged breath. "You think you've won?" He spat. "You think you know everything." Holmes stepped forward. "I know enough." Langley's fingers tightened on the documents. "Then," he murmured, "let's see how much survives the fire." He struck a match, and the papers burst into flame. The fire devoured the documents in an instant, the flames licking greedily at the brittle paper. Langley's eyes gleamed with desperate triumph. Holmes, however, merely sighed. "Watson," he said mildly, "be so good as to retrieve the originals from my coat pocket." Langley's face drained of colour. I reached inside Holmes's coat and withdrew an identical stack of papers, untouched, perfectly intact. Langley took a step back. "Number, that's not." Holmes's smile was razor sharp. "You didn't think I would let you handle the real evidence, did you?" Langley staggered, his back pressed against the cold asylum wall. "You've lost," Holmes said softly. "Completely." Langley's breath shuddered, his hands twitching at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might run, might hurl himself into the dark abyss of the asylum's ruins rather than face what awaited him. Then, from the corridor behind us, footsteps. And moments later, the authorities arrived. Inspector Lestrade emerged from the darkness, his revolver drawn, flanked by 2 constables. His gaze swept over the scene before settling on Holmes. "You have what you need?" he asked gruffly. Holmes nodded. Langley orchestrated the entire deception, the forged death, the hidden conspiracy, the second murder, when Charles Winthrop tried to reclaim his life. He handed Lestrade the original documents. "Everything is here." Langley's hands were wrenched behind his back, the iron cuffs snapping shut around his wrists. He let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "You've sealed your own fate, Holmes," he hissed. "You think you've exposed them? The 5 ravens are not finished." Holmes's expression did not change. "No," he said. "But you are." Lestrade gave a nod. "Take him away." The constables dragged Langley toward the exit, his final words swallowed by the void of the asylum. Holmes turned to me. "It's over, Watson." But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction, because I could see it in his eyes. He was not certain. As the last echoes of Langley's footsteps faded into silence, I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. "It's done," I murmured. "Finally." Holmes, however, had turned to the old asylum records, his fingers flipping through the pages with a strange urgency. "Holmes." I stepped forward. "What are you looking for?" His fingers stilled. And then, without a word, he turned the open ledger toward me. I felt the blood drain from my face. Charles Winthrop's file was still active. I stared at the single word beneath his name. Status. Active. "That's impossible," I whispered. "We saw his body." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Did we?" The asylum loomed around us, silent and waiting. And somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open. We returned to 221B Baker Street in silence. Holmes had barely spoken since the asylum. His movements were precise, methodical, but I saw the storm behind his eyes. It was nearing midnight when Mrs. Hudson knocked. "A letter, Mr. Holmes," she said, setting a small envelope upon the table. I frowned. "At this hour?" Holmes lifted it carefully, turning it in his fingers. There was no return address. The paper was fresh, the ink barely dry. I leaned over his shoulder as he broke the seal, my breath catching as I read the signature at the bottom. Charles Winthrop. My heart pounded. "Holmes, this isn't possible." Holmes did not look at me. His eyes were fixed on something else. The date. 3 days from now. A silence fell over the room, and in the cold glow of the gaslight, Sherlock Holmes murmured, "Some mysteries, Watson, are better left unsolved." Chapter 6. The Haunting Aftermath. Eleanor Redgrave stood by the window of 221B Baker Street, the first pale streaks of dawn casting a fragile glow across her face. She had packed lightly, one small trunk at her feet, a worn leather-bound book clutched in her hands. "There is nothing left for me in London," she murmured. Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled. I glanced at Holmes, but he said nothing. He merely observed her, his sharp gaze flickering over the faint bruise along her wrist, the tightness in her jaw, the way she avoided looking at the streets below. "You do not intend to return," he said at last. She shook her head. "Some things cannot be escaped," she whispered, "but one can try." A silence stretched between them. Then, Holmes reached into his coat, withdrawing a small silver key. "Winthrop's pendant," he said. "You may wish to keep it." She hesitated. "And if I do not?" Holmes's lips curved just slightly. "Then I shall keep it for you." Her eyes met his, something unspoken passing between them. Then, with a final nod, she turned and walked toward the waiting carriage. The door shut behind her, and just like that, Eleanor Redgrave vanished into the mist. The house was quiet after Eleanor's departure. too quiet. I poured a measure of brandy, though my hands were not entirely steady. Across the room, Holmes sat in his chair, the faint glow of his pipe illuminating the letter in his hands. Winthrop's letter. I had read it a dozen times, yet the words never changed. Holmes, if you are reading this, then the game is not yet finished. There are things you do not know, things that must remain hidden. The truth is not what you think it is. You must forget me. Forget all of this. Do not look further. For your own sake. Charles Winthrop. The signature was unmistakable. The ink was fresh. The date, 3 days in the future. I exhaled. Holmes, this is madness. He did not respond. I leaned forward. It must be a forgery. Holmes's fingers traced the edge of the paper. Perhaps. I hesitated. But you don't believe that, do you? For the first time that night, Holmes met my gaze, and I saw something I had never seen before. Uncertainty. The fire crackled softly. The city outside had begun to stir, the gaslights flickering into the haze of morning. Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed upon the letter. There must be an explanation, I pressed. There must be. Still, he said nothing. And that frightened me more than anything. I had seen Sherlock Holmes unravel the most impossible of mysteries, had watched him reduce the supernatural to mere trickery, the unexplainable to cold logic. Yet now, he hesitated. I have seen a man die twice, Watson, he murmured at last. I have traced his name through the records of an asylum that should not remember him. He set the letter down. And now he writes to me from beyond the grave. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. There is an explanation, he said. There must be. But in his voice, I heard it. The smallest, most fleeting tremor of doubt. A silence settled between us. Then, with slow deliberation, Holmes reached for the matchbox beside him. I watched as he struck a flame, held the letter to it, and let it burn. The last remnants of Charles Winthrop curled to ash, and in the dim firelight, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move across the window. The rain had begun to fall softly against the windows of 221B Baker Street, casting trembling shadows across the floor. I sat by the fire, my journal open before me, yet for the first time in many years, I found myself unable to write. Even with Langley arrested and the conspiracy exposed, I could not shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. I thought of Charles Winthrop, his body vanishing, reappearing, and vanishing again. The asylum ledger that marked him as active, long after his death. The whisper in the dark, the creaking door at Ravenshire Asylum, and the letter. I turned to where it lay upon the table, now nothing but ash in the hearth. Yet, though Holmes had burned it, its words remained. Do not look further, for your own sake. I exhaled, rubbing my temples. Holmes sat across from me, motionless. He had not spoken in some time, his fingers lightly drumming against the arm of his chair. His pipe had gone out. Holmes, I murmured at last, do you believe we have seen the last of Charles Winthrop? His fingers stilled. The fire crackled. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Holmes replied, I am not certain we ever truly saw him at all. The air inside felt too close, too thick with things left unsaid. I need air, I muttered, rising from my chair. Holmes made no protest, merely reaching for his coat as I moved toward the door. The streets of Baker Street were hushed, the usual bustle of London reduced to an eerie quiet beneath the heavy fog. Gas lamps flickered, their glow swallowed by the mist before it could reach the ground. As we stepped onto the pavement, I turned back, my gaze drawn, unbidden, to the window of our sitting room. And then I saw him. For the briefest, most impossible of moments, a figure stood within the glass, his features half obscured by the wavering glow of the fire. Charles Winthrop. His eyes, hollow, watchful, locked onto mine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Then, a blink, a flicker. The window was empty once more. I whirled toward Holmes, my heart hammering. Holmes! He was already watching me. I saw him, I whispered. Holmes did not move. Did you? The words were simple, but the way he spoke them, it was as if he had expected this. The fog curled around us, thick and impenetrable, muffling the distant sounds of the city. I turned away from the window, my pulse still racing. Holmes, I said carefully. If it was not Winthrop, then who or what did I see? Holmes exhaled, adjusting the folds of his coat. There are things, Watson, he murmured, that even I cannot explain. I stared at him. You are saying you do not know? He glanced at me then, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something unfamiliar in his expression. Not fear, not doubt. Something far worse. A truth he had chosen to ignore. Come, he said at last, turning away from 221B Baker Street, stepping into the waiting mist. The night grows cold. I hesitated, glancing once more at the empty window. Then, with a final shiver, I followed. As the fog swallowed our footsteps, Holmes spoke one last time, his voice barely more than a whisper. Some mysteries, Watson, he murmured, are better left unsolved. And for the first time in my life, I believed him.